Are you Canadian, Alex Lowe?
I feel like I would have to be in some ways. I feel like making films in Canada will kind of inherently do that in some sense of, or at least like someone that inhabits the space. Like, say, I don't know, if you make a film in Paris, doesn't mean that you're from Paris. But if you live long enough, I feel like getting a sense of the sense of the space and the politics and the geography and the culture has a lot of specificity into informing the films you make. Um, and I think the films I make currently certainly is being informed by the place. Um, because I feel like a hypocrite if I said I'm a Hong Kong filmmaker because I've never made a film about that place.
But I also feel like with why do ants go back to their nest? Um, as far as I can tell, your identity of like being from Hong Kong is so attached to it as well. From the fact of like narratively, you're trying
Mm-hmm.
to build a tunnel there. And also you had like the line where you mentioned like, um, about the anxiety and about like how like, you have like the newspaper like showings and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it really interesting, cause I don't know. I feel like it's like this full like Canadianness, but like in a different form of identity that like you don't really see in Canada, or like Canadian film doesn't, I guess, want to show you. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think you are a Hong Kong filmmaker because of that. At least from that one film. So I think it's interesting that you would say like you weren't.
I feel like I'll have to be both.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that by relating to something, it does make. Uh, I think okay, like I think uh a lot about what a film is about, and by engaging with the dialogue of what a thing is about and the threads that goes through uh these subjects allows a space of specificity to exist. I don't know if that makes sense. Like for instance, if my magazine sequence has Cantonese and Cantonese images, and within the image inherently has that kind of quality to be um, from Hong Kong, kind of these artifacts and images makes it about it. And the relation definitely like within the film is about relating to those things and yearning or longing for it, or relating to a sense of rootism. And I think the film actively, at least during the time when I wrote it, is about challenging that idea, that of asking whether there is a need to go back. Um, but I feel like everyone that is an immigrant uh, has this kind of obsession over homeland, and like everyone, like even like talking to Uber drivers, just like people not from here, they would tell me about this. Like, oh, I've came here 6 years ago, but I regret it. I hope I never left or
Whoa,
something.
that's
Or like,
crazy.
but like they kind of have to leave because of wars and like
Yeah,
political conflict, or they're like they don't feel safe, something.
yeah.
And so what can you do? Um, and they still live here. They visit homeland sometimes, but like they live here.
I think in the manifesto you wrote, what's the, you wrote recollect by correlation, not representation.
Uh, why does this sound kind of smart?
Cause you wrote it. You are smart.
Um, during that time, I was really into this Deleuzian idea, and I'm not entirely too intelligent to understand a specific idea, but there is this YouTube video about it. So essentially, there's this idea about representation, and I forgot it specifically. It's been a while, but anyways, this YouTuber explains that idea where about through a drum machine. So when normal people, especially when the drum machine had just came into invention, people thought of it as a machine that plays drum, something that impersonates a drum. So they wanted to treat it like it's like a second drum, right? And it should sound like a drum. It should like a MIDI piano, right? That or a Casio that plays upright piano music. There's a certain sound you expect, and there's now with all those conception, you have an expectation of what it should sound like. Well, it should sound like a drum, and so. But obviously, especially the first kind of drum machines, it sounds nothing like a drum. It sounds new. It sounds digitalized. It sounds 8-bit. And so this idea that, okay, maybe we should not treat it as a drum, but its own thing. And so rather than having this abstract object, this, what's his face? Like an ideal.
The idea of a
like
platonic
Plato?
idea.
Yeah.
So it's very much a kind of a an antithesis or a challenging of that.
Yes.
Instead of treating a drum machine as a faltering attempt at achieving the ideal of a drum, it is a whole different thing in and of itself.
Yes.
Oh, that's
Exactly.
really beautiful.
Exactly. And so that rule was to go like, okay, I don't have an higher idea to try to have a specific idea to impersonate this higher idea. So rather than that, I would have these ideas being itself.
But then, how do you fight the idea being, um, I don't know if that's the word, like tokenization, but
Tokenization.
like the idea being just like doesn't have depth. It's just like it's
Face
just
value?
yeah, like just like an idea.
Oh, well, that comes with the correlation.
Ah,
So all of those ideas eventually makes up the sum of what I want to talk about. Yes.
Sorry, I was going to say, pulling on kind of another Deleuzian idea that might be influencing this is, I used the word rhizomatic earlier. That the idea of a rhizome, I mean, that's something that exists in botany.
Oh, yes, the rhizome.
Yeah, so that sounds relevant.
Yeah.
Deleuze talks about this a lot. So a rhizome is, if we think of like crabgrass, it doesn't have a root system. It doesn't have a central root. In other words, if you trace back kind of don't know enough about botany to know exactly what it's called. Okay, so you know how a tree, you can trace back all of kind of the outgrowths of it
yeah.
to where it starts. Rhizomes don't really have this.
Oh.
Rhizomes don't have a central root from which everything is coming from and traceable back to. It's kind of this continuous thing which circles around. And there's relationality between all of the parts. But it's not a firm kind of coming out of a single origin point.
Yes.
So it seems like, at least in how you're talking about this, there is an interrelationship between these ideas, but there is no central sprouting idea from which they all come from.
Ba-bing, ba-boom.
Ah.
Sounds like a genius idea. Who wrote this? Anyways, my thing exactly to that, back then I was much more obsessive about this idea exactly about relating to the anti-rootist idea, the broader idea that one should perhaps forget about where you're from. Like, during that time I was much more rigid into thinking like, okay, when I was 16 I came here, let's forget about where I came from.
Wow.
Very much anti the normative narrative of people talking about, okay, I'm from, I don't know, I'm from Hong Kong. This is my Hong Kong story. This is my Hong Kong side.
Yeah.
I have my Hong Kong thing going on. Although I might live in Canada, but it's a part of me. I think for this film, especially when I made it, is like, I'm going to go like, fuck it. I'm going to abandon this.
Like, abandoning of your roots.
Exactly. Like, because I feel like during that time, it was a curse. Like, I think it's, and still I think it's a curse. I think homeland shifts depending on who you know, how you relate to where you grew up.
I
Right?
bitch.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know.
Bitch.
Sorry. Being from Cuba and being Cuban,
Mm-hmm.
depending on what kind of Cuban you are, and like the Cuban community is this weird ambiguous thing that like changes entirely depending on like what side of history you kind of come from.
Mm-hmm.
And it does lead to this like ambiguous cloud of identity where like to try to reclaim.
Yeah. And
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
no, I feel like, and like I would be interested of how other people thought about this. It was just kind of my conclusion. Easier said than done, but I feel like even when I'm in Hong Kong, I'm a bit of an outcast. So I shouldn't think about Hong Kong as, oh, I go back and it's all welcoming and shit. I mean, obviously, everyone from where they're from has their own conflict within wherever they live, whether that's societal or moral or law or whatever. So I don't know. It comes with a complexity. But I think the big thing is like when you live long enough and you look back, you would go like, okay, I spend my teenage years here, I spend my 20s here, and then so on and so forth. Like your experience is tied to a place. We have to because we are people, and you would think of like specific time and a specific period differently than this grander idea of like, I am from here, I am this blood, I am this and that. You know, I guess I don't have anything against it, but it was like I kind of want to break the curse.
But I think what's so powerful about that is like, because I spent most of my life here in Canada, so it's like when I think about what is like the patriotism that comes from Canada. Like, what is I am from here. This is what I am. This is what I do. It kind of like doesn't give me anything to hold on to. Like, it's just like this loose, ambiguous thing.
I mean, yeah, I think the other different curse is that you come here and you find it harder to have a specific grasp on things. I feel like that's the film I'm making now is examining an alien space. And I do feel similarly. The thing about, like, when I think about Hong Kong, and I think people from other places, and especially if you grew up there, is that there's a lot of particularity. There's a lot of specificity into your livelihood and how you think about the place. For like how the street sounds, how the people sound, how the food tastes, how the air feels. A lot of like little poetic little details about the place. And that kind of forms this like essence of the city that becomes much more abstract when you're in another place, I feel like. And when you're here, you're thinking about there. And when you're there, you're thinking about here. I certainly thought about Canada when I was there.
Wow.
I think the thing about Canada, perhaps why it feels like this is because there's a certain feeling of liberation. There's a certain feeling of openness that does allow me to think better. Like mentally, because like I feel like especially East Asia has a lot of rules and social rules and expectations. You can't dress a certain way. You have to like do this and that, and especially if you're in Hong Kong and you're another race, you're probably getting more stares than if you're another race here.
Yeah.
To be honest. And so I think about Homeland as a place of condition where almost biologically you're there for an extended period of time and you get conditioned into all these rules and you find your particular way of life over there. And now you come over here, there's new rules. There's a feeling of displacement, and I feel like that's where the displacement comes from. I'm also not a biologist, but or a social scientist, but like I feel like we lost that specificity into how we think how we think about the way of life, and different places have different rules, and if you go to America, there might be a different set of rules. Dude, we recently played in the eyesore, and the host walked out, like had a cigarette during while they were playing my film, and the other films were quite quiet, and then when my film hit, it was so loud, and that was the loudest screening of the film ever.
Whoa.
It was like
so
loud that people had to like cover their ears.
Whoa, no!
Yeah, it was like a Swans concert. It was so crazy. It was like,
whoa.
And then I was like, oh, I'm sorry. And then some people were like, no, it was awesome.
Yeah, that's radical.
Others might not think this. But yeah.
I do like, and something I look up to you and that you've taught me, not by like, I know, but is the idea of film school as a way to like analyze and like critique, but also like work on film. And like you mentioned like film essays and like how this was sort of like a film essay unto itself.
Right. Yow. So yeah, the film is directly inspired by two films, Sans Soleil and Rain Vermans Domus. Anyways, they like yeah the essay film. I mean, I it has the structure of an essay. Um, that my thesis is obviously I'm building digging the hole, and then like once that hit, everybody either gets on board or not. I think it's pretty quick to know whether a person would like the film or not. Um, on how they react to that line specifically. If people laugh, I think they would like what comes. If they didn't, they would hate what comes.
Really? I never thought that your film was a comedy. So I never thought of people laughing during your movie.
I think what's interesting, at least to the screenings I've been to, that people always laugh about on that line.
Huh.
And that is a line that initiates this, I think, to me, a sense of mass hysteria of whether you're on board on this ridiculous, absurd thing or not.
But why is that funny?
Because it's ridiculous.
Is it though?
To people.
Also, the whole, as a way for people to talk about things, is like, what are people in Canada really talking about? And like, what are people in Canada, and what type of Canadians are talking about things? That I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Like, I think these days I'm much more interested in locality and the closer distance of engagement rather than a vague thing of like, oh, my film's going to get played in the UK and in the US and Armenia. That becomes way more abstract and feels like a Silk Road. Feels like trading.
Yeah.
You know, and people like we're like what are people gonna do with my film? And like what? Like you watch in India and what now? What? But if you watch it in Canada, I feel like probably has much more of a consequences.
Especially because Canada's image environment is one that has historically been given to other people. Mm-hmm. Like, America, like, let's say Toronto's always been used as a way to film a different type of city.
Exactly. I feel like Canada, especially Canadian landscape, had always been an imaginary space for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
For, in some ways... I'm like making up a new theory, but like
do it.
And in some ways that like the Canadian landscape within the mainstream doesn't really exist, except for Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Yes.
Like where they could have easily said, oh, this film, oh. Like Scott, hey Scott, you're going to that Californian restaurant, and then that whole thing is California.
Yeah.
Whatever the fuck. I feel like there is some power into saying like this is Toronto, that's the CN Tower, or whatever the fuck. Yeah. And Canada is kind of stripped away, even locally to. It's kind of weird. Like it's okay. Like for instance, Like for instance, like okay, say there is a restaurant that is in Spadina that is really famous because they shot the new Scorsese film there, and now this space, although bringing tourists, is recognized in correlation to America.
Yes.
It's in some weird psychological thing. It's like no longer Canadian space.
Yes, and bitch, this is why the line about Hamilton stuck with me so much, because there's no way you couldn't trace that back to Hamilton itself as a place. Like, there's nothing else that your film could exist in except for in Canada and Toronto. And another one of my readings talks about the diasporic experience as like an experience that like many people feel, and many people, even though it's different, between all like different ethnicities and cultures is something that like everybody low key kind of like understands what it means to be away from your home or a new place and new rules. And for me, Canada being one of the largest like countries, period, in terms of space,
Mm-hmm.
and as well as population, and how many people we get coming to this country, for like the films about Canada and its diaspora, kind of being like what you were saying about how like York has only like one type, like they're only pushing you for one type of thing. I feel like the experience of diaspora, at least in this country, is low key pushed to be like one type of thing. Like they only want you to make one type of film, but like there's no real intersectionality in terms of like what you're experiencing in the space you're experiencing around. It feels like it's almost like, oh, you're from Hong Kong, talk about your experience being from Hong Kong. But I feel like what makes it Canadian is like you're talking about like your own Canadian experience in Canada,
Yeah.
and then your experience from Hong Kong and like the tunnel and stuff is more about your own personal stuff. But it like
Mm-hmm.
your Canadianness is this like thing that can't be taken and can't be put anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. I'm so
Sorry.
glad.
I got
But
excited.
I think it's really interesting within the spectrum of the film is just that whole thing, say specifically that magazine thing of when I was like, Hong Kong people had always been paranoid. These are the magazines that dates back to 19, whatever the fuck. In some ways I'm lying.
Mm.
In some ways, I mean, I definitely don't think this.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat. But I feel like there's something interesting about how people talk about race and how people talk about people from there has a certain specificity. And so me saying like Hong Kong people is paranoid species, it's kind of absurd.
Yes.
I mean, no one picks up on that, but it's like maybe too commonly spoken about.
But I also think that that's low key this country as well, where like you can say anything about any type of people, and they'll be like,
Which is crazy.
and it's
like,
so crazy.
I mean, like it dives into this different type of stereotype. Like people are so blinded by this thing